Well, thank you very much. This is a real pleasure to be here. Heidi, thank you for inviting me. Colleagues, thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts. I was going to kick off by starting off with the earlier panel discussion earlier on, because I think it does enable me to frame where I'm coming from. And I wanted to start off with Joseph's wonderful presentation, but a question that I posed to him, because I think it does tell you where one wants to locate one's thought processes and where one is going. And then one of the questions that emerged, I think, from one of the panelists here, as one of the final questions of that session, and Joseph said, which I think is important, is that we must approach transformation with humility. And he used this wonderful example of revolutions can land up in a mess in ways that we do not anticipate. And I think he's absolutely right on both questions. We do need to approach transformation with humility, and revolutions can emerge in a mess. But status quo and leaving the status quo can also be a mess. And so if you were on the receiving end of the Mubarak regime in Egypt, life wasn't pleasant. And so you do want to start thinking about how we move forward. And what this poses for me is, as a social scientist, I do want to reflect on the social sciences, but I do want to do so in a way that allows us to lead. I am mindful of the fact that where we lead to cannot always be predicted, and it will have unintended consequences, and it will provoke further social contradictions. So you're not going to come by any means to an end of history, but you're opening up a new environment of struggle, a new environment of tensions, and a new environment of possibilities. And for me, I think that that's important, because otherwise you'll end up into this event that we can't change anything. And therefore that all we can do is tell stories of past events, but not being able to try and make informed choice about our future. And I do want to hold at least the prospect of making informed choices about our future. I also want to go back to one of the issues that were posed about how the danger is that we will retreat into a kind of academic discussion. Now, I don't think academic discussion is a bad thing, by the way. I am worried about a view that simply activism for its own sake has its benefits. Because I think activism without any understanding of the science of change can lead to unproductive engagement that doesn't lead to transformations in the kinds of ways that we want. So if you like, my conversation earlier on was, and I used deliberately I used the earlier conversation because it does frame where I would like to go. On the one hand, a belief that social science can inform change and the science of change, and that the utilization of that science of change can benefit one in directing struggles towards transformation, fully realizing that does not always lead to the kinds of outcomes we want, and that it might create a new round of social contradictions and social change. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second is much of my thoughts is really based on a book that came out about 9 months ago. And really it was a book on transformation and transition in South Africa. But it cheekily had, if you like, a final chapter to it, which is an essay on what does the South African experience say about the global literature on transformations. What is possible, what is not, why something's possible, why was that change so different from how we imagined, and what are the lessons to be learned. Now, it's true that you're doing so from hindsight, but you're trying to do so with an understanding of how should it inform transformations going forward. And that's what I think I'm going to largely be speaking about in this context. So I've been slightly more gutsy in saying I'm going to answer the questions quite directly. Do I think, and how do transformations get initiated? They get initiated when new political and social actors enter the political scene. Now, sometimes those political and social actors are a product of long, prolonged struggle, like in South Africa over decades. But often, they're also a product of evolutionary change, such as changes in demographics and a new generation emerging in that context. But even in the context where they emerge, as new change, as new actors, as a result of evolutionary change, there is a process of conscientization. I was struck by last night's conversation about how somebody, I think, said we had multiple identities. But not all identities have the same level of political saliency. Why some identities have political saliency and others don't is really a product of political choice. It's a product of political struggle. It's a product of political conscientization. And I think it's important that people get activated either through that project of struggle and conscientization, or as Joseph said, I think, through a catalysmic event that suddenly brings onto the agenda something dramatic. And we've seen this in the debate around environmental and climate change. Now, that's the second point I wanted to make. The third is, if you like, what worries me about the transformation literature and much of the development literature is it has policy wonks dominating that conversation. Too many policy researchers. And while I think it's important that they focus on evidence and they focus on policy, I think they make a really dangerous assumption that policy making is a rational process. That policy making is a product of getting the right evidence on the table. And if suddenly you got the right evidence and your evidence is superior, then everybody else will say, well, absolutely right, and here's it, we're going to adopt your policy agenda. I think what we should be very, very clear about is that what this literature tends to ignore is the issue of power. And what this literature ignores is that in any transformation experiment, there are powerful stakeholders who are intent on subverting transformation. And that what we need to be conscious of, if you're really interested in sustainable transformation, then what you have to understand is while evidence for progressive policy is important, but even more important is an understanding of power and how you get leverage over powerful stakeholders. Because if you cannot figure out how to get leverage over powerful stakeholders, the entire development agenda or the transformation agenda will come to naught. You can have the best evidence in the world. It's not going to happen because, frankly, what you need to figure out is how to gain leverage. And in the dilemma around transformation, and I'm assuming many people in this room are interested in transformation in the interests of poor people, however we categorize the term, in the interests of communities that are marginalized. If you're interested in that, then you've got to figure out how do you give poor people power. That is the really essential dilemma of development. Because you can have charity as much as anyone and you can give poor people resources. But if you really want to make it sustainable, you've got to give them power. Because if you can give them power, you make the system responsive to their interests. The problem is, it's kind of oxymoron. How do you give poor people power? How do you give powerless people power? And that's the interesting debate that I think the development literature ducks. And that's the debate that we really need to understand if you understand change. And I want to answer that by the way you give poor people power is by two things. The first is you organize and mobilize them. And the second is you divide the political and economic elites on whom they distinguish. So that's the trick about the game. If you want to understand the methodology of change, you have to do two things. Firstly, you've got to mobilize poor people or marginalized people because that gives them a sense of conscientization, a sense of energy. It's through the collective that they receive that. But second, you've got to divide the other side. You've got to divide political and economic elites. You've got to make them fight amongst themselves because the way they fight amongst themselves, you become, by a relational question, much more powerful. There is a third, which I think is often ignored by activists. And that is you've got to weave a policy agenda that can appeal to multiple stakeholders. Because if you can't do that, you're not able to divide the other side and unite yourself. So you've got to have three parts. One is mobilization. Second is divide political and economic elites. And the third, it seems to me, is you need to weave a political agenda that is able to appeal to multiple stakeholders. And I want to quickly look at two case studies of this. The first is the example of inclusive economic development. in almost all cases of inclusive economic development, a la social democracy or the development state in Southeast Asia, you had a couple of things happening. You had the mobilization of people in Western Europe through the trade union movement. I think it was fundamental and essential to that process. In many parts of the developing world, through the emergence of peasant rebellions. That's the first thing that you had to do. And what these rebellions did is they constituted a threat, an economic threat, and it divided political and economic elites. And political and economic elites, including in Scandinavia, by the way, were quite confronted by these threats and realizing that they had the prospect of losing everything. They cut a deal to keep some of their privileges. And that's, if you like, the understanding and the emergence of social democracy in large parts of the last 50 years. You cannot actually imagine, and at least my studies are quite clear on this, that you cannot imagine the emergence of social democracy in the post-World War II period without, in both Western Europe and Southeast Asia, without understanding the enabling environment of the Cold War. For all of its other problems, what it did at the global level is it fostered a United States that was much more open to developmental concessions. That hasn't been available in the last 20 years in the development possibility. So that's the first example. The second, and very quickly, I'm going to shut up at this point, is the environmental sustainability question. I mean, one of the frightening things about this debate for me is how much of it is based on the principle of rationality. If we just provided enough evidence, the Republicans in the US will just agree and we'll have a new world order. And I think that that's a dangerous thing. You're going to have to think about mobilization much more effectively, and you're going to have to think about dividing political and economic elites. What is interesting in the corporate sector is that there is now a group of people in the corporate sector with an interest in renewable energies who are now actually pro the climate change and pro because it actually serves their own interests. And that's something that you need to look at. You've got much more European governments that are much more sympathetic, but we still need to think about a much more effective agenda against both the United States, but also groups like China, etc. And the policy agenda has to look at how do you address the issue of payment? Who's going to pay for the costs of a more climate-friendly industrialization agenda? Because if you don't address that, I can guarantee you Africa is going to repeat the mistakes of Western Europe and China, and by that time, the world will have no future. So to sum up, if we're interested in advancing transformation, a couple of lessons. First, we need to go beyond simply evidence-based policy to confronting issues of power. We need to understand how to get leverage over opponents of transformation, how to divide elites, how to mobilize citizens, and how to develop policy scenarios that can appeal to multiple stakeholders. And if you don't do that, we'll never be able to succeed in a sustainable transformation agenda. Thank you very, very much.